Jai Sitaram. Ayodhya chapter 18. In the previous sections, we saw how Rama comes to Dasaratha's palace and he sees that his father is being very morose. He questions Kaikeyi as to what has happened, what calamity has befallen his father, and he also wants to know what he can do to mitigate that calamity, that misfortune, that sorrow of the king. Kaikeyi says that the king is not angry with him and he actually wants to speak to Rama, but is hesitant to do so because he's afraid that Rama will not fulfill his wishes. And Kaikeyi goes on to explain that the king had given her 2 boons and now repents having given her those 2 boons. And if Rama promises to fulfill those 2 boons, then she is going to recite what those 2 boons were. And Rama is aghast. He cannot believe that his mother even doubts his sincerity in serving his father. So he says, "My dear mother, if my father wants me to do so, I will happily drink poison. I will happily enter flames. I will happily drown in the ocean." And he says, "Karishye pratijane, I promise to fulfill those 2 boons." So now please tell me, because Rama doesn't speak twice. Ramaha dvirna abhibhashate. Rama doesn't have to speak twice. If he says a thing once, that means that it is valid for all eternity. So we see the extreme kindness of the Lord in this sense, because Dasaratha was in a crossroads. He did not know whether he had to do the duty of a king and fulfill his 2 boons to one of his queens, which would mean that his favorite son goes off to the forest, or should he fulfill the duties of a father and protect his son from an unjust punishment? What should he do? So he was tormented within these conflicting dharmas. So now Rama extricates him from this confusion, and Rama says, "I promise to fulfill those 2 boons for you." So, contrary to popular belief, Dasaratha never really asks Rama to go to the forest. Here, Rama himself says that he is promising to fulfill those 2 boons of Kaikeyi, and therefore he goes ahead to the forest. He relinquishes his claim to the throne to Bharata, all because he himself promised to do so. So the blame is shifted from Dasaratha. So anyone who knows this can no longer blame Dasaratha for having sent his righteous son to the forest. Of course, Dasaratha himself blamed so, but technically Rama promised to go to the forest. He says, "I promise. Karishye pratijane. I promise to do so." And Ramaha dvirna abhibhashate. I don't have to promise twice. If I say I promise, that means I promise. Verse 31. Tam arjava samayuktam anarya satyavadinam uvacha ramam Kaikeyi vachanam bhrishyadarunam. Then Kaikeyi, the most hardened of sinners, addressed herself to Rama, the soul of truth and candor, and said the following words. So, how does Valmiki compare Kaikeyi's speaking style and Rama's speaking style? He has mentioned that Kaikeyi is anarya. She's very vulgar. She's very cruel. And Brishadarunam, exceptionally cruel words, is what she's trying to speak to Rama. But however, how is Rama? Rama is Satyavadinam. That means he always speaks the truth. So, Brishadarunam Anarya Kaikeyi is going to speak to Satyavadinam Ramam. And Rama is also Arjava Samayuktam. He is very committed to being very sincere and he is full of candor. So the Anarya Brishadarunam Kaikeyi is speaking to Satyavadinam Arjava Samayuktam Rama. Verse 32. Pura devasure yuddhe pitra te mama raghava rakshitena varo datto sashalyena maharane. In the long past, there was a great battle between the gods and the asuras in which your father fought for the gods. The asuras wounded him grievously so that he was at death's door. I brought him back to life and safety, and he was pleased to give me 2 boons. So, Kaikeyi starts the recitation by impressing upon Rama how Dasaratha owed his life to Kaikeyi. She could have just said that I was given 2 boons and these are those. But she doesn't do it that way. She said that I protected your father and he gave me those 2 boons in return. So the very life of Dasaratha is now equated to 2 boons. And isn't it so surprising that because of those 2 boons, especially one of those 2 boons, Dasaratha loses that very life. So the first thing Kaikeyi establishes is that Dasaratha owes her something. Dasaratha gave those 2 boons to her as a transport of gratitude for her having saved his life. And therefore, he owes her. Verse 33. Tatra me yachitaha raja bharatasya abhishechanam gamanam dandaka aranye tavacha adya eva raghava. I demand them of him now. If you have any care that the promises made by yourself and by your father should hold good, pay heed to my words. Bharata, my son, should be crowned as the heir apparent today, and with the very articles prepared towards your coronation. You should cancel all the arrangements made for your installation and live for 14 years in the forest of Dandaka like a recluse. So there you go. She gives the next statement. I'm asking for the coronation of Bharata and you should go off to Dandaka forest. These are her 2 boons. She doesn't give any reasons as to why she wants her son to be the next king or why she wants Rama to go off to the forest. She just says, your father owes me and now my 2 boons are that Bharata should become the king and you should go to the forest. So it's very curt and right. Bharatasya abhishechanam and then gamanam dandakaranye tava. So Rama, you should go to, gamanam means you should go, dandakaranye. You should go to Dandakaranya. Bharatasya abhishechanam, the coronation of Bharata. So these are her 2 boons. She lays that foundation right away. So in one verse, she says that Dasaratha owes her something. The next one, she says, these are those 2 boons. Verse 34. Yadi satya pratignyam tvam pitaram kartum ichchasi atmanam cha narashreshta mama vakyam idam shrunu. O Rama, if you want to make yourself and your father faithful to the promise, listen to these words of mine. Verse 35. Sa nideshe pitustishta yatha tena pratishrutam tvaya aranyam praveshtavyam navavarshani panchacha. Abide by your father's command, As per his boon, you have to stay in the forest for 14 years. So, Nava Varshani Pancha cha means, Nava means 9, Pancha means 5, and cha. So, you have 9 and 5 years, which is 14. Verse 36. भारतस्तवभिषेच्यत यद एतद् अभिषेचनं त्वद् अर्थे विहितं राज्ञा तेन सर्वेण राघव. Bharata has to be enthroned with the use of the complete collection of articles that the king arranged for your sake. Verse 37. Sapta sapta cha varshani dandakaranyam ashritah abhishekam imam tvaktva jata chiradhara vasa. You have to reside in the Dandaka forest as a recluse with matted hair, deer skin, and bark of trees. Verse 38. Bharataha Koshalapure prashastu vasudham imam nana ratna samakiranam savaji ratha kunjaram. And my Bharata should reign from this Ayodhya over the broad earth with all its treasures of gold and silver, horses and elephants. So just imagine how Dasaratha is feeling at this moment. We have got to understand the situation from Dasaratha's perspective. He is listening to his once upon a time favorite wife tell his favorite son that no, you are no longer going to be the king. Yes, your father promised that you are going to be the king today, but no, because of his promise to me, I want you to go away to the forest, behave as a recluse, wear matted hair and deer skin and bark of trees, and whatever paraphernalia was collected for your coronation, that is going to go on to coronate your younger brother Bharata. And Bharata will rule over this broad earth with all sorts of wealth, and you are to just go off and be a recluse. How on earth would Dasaratha have felt at this time? Rama, for him, living in the forest and living in the palace is absolutely the same thing. That's why I'm not asking the listeners to think about things from Rama's perspective. But imagine what plight Dasaratha must be undergoing at this moment. And Rama's every feeling is now tied to Dasaratha's. We have already seen that Valmiki has called him as Pita Hiteratah. Because of Pita Hiteratah, because of wanting to do something beneficial for his father, even before Kaikeyi recites the story, Rama promises to fulfill those boons. And without any shame, she speaks some very cruel words, Brishadarunam words. And she says, the same materials that are supposed to be for your coronation should now go off to coronate Bharata. And you should leave Ayodhya immediately and you should reside in Dandakaranya for 14 years as a recluse. And now she says, this is why Dasaratha is not very happy at this moment. Verse 39. Etena tvam narendroyam karunyena samaplutah shoka sanklishta vadano na shaknoti nirikshitam. The king is torn between the conflicting emotions of love, compassion, and grief. Worn and emaciated and bewildered, he will not even allow you to see him. Verse 40. Etat kuru narendrasya vachanam raghunandana satyana mahata Rama tarayasva nareshwaram. O bright scion of the Raghus, who never went back upon their plighted word, fulfill the promise made by your sire. Walk in the path of truth and save him from the jaws of hell. And thus Kaikeyi concludes the statements. And she explains, oh, your father is now confused. That is the reason why he is not able to speak to you. Now, let us see how Rama behaves. Verse 41. Itiva tasyam purusham vadanteyam na chaiva Ramaha pravivesha shokam pravivyade chapi mahanubhavo rajatu putra vyasanabi taptaha. The cruel words fell on the wounded heart of Dasaratha, and he writhed in impotent agony. Alas, what have I done to be doomed to this torture? To listen, all powerless, to such dreadful words from this fiend in human shape? Why was I chosen the instrument of inflicting this cruel injury upon Rama, dearer to me than life itself? A shameful act which even his worst enemies would shrink from polluting their hands with? But Rama's heart was, if possible, more serene and joyful in that he was offered a chance to exhibit his filial duty. His face was a faithful index of his heart and showed not the least sign of grief, anger, or disappointment. Never for a moment did the thought cross his mind, what grievous injustice! What a dreadful irony of fate! This crown is mine by right of birth. My father promised it to me before the world, and now at the last moment I am to lose it, to give my consent without a pang to see the son of my stepmother seated on the throne, to renounce with a smiling face the comforts, the luxuries, the wealth, pomp, and power of what I was taught to expect as legitimately mine, and doom myself to a living death in the dreadful forest of Dandakaranya for 14 livelong years. Verily, no one would speak in the same breath of misery and unhappiness, and the Supreme Lord, one of the gems in whose radiant crown is infinite bliss. So, Valmiki says, Rama was absolutely serene. Sorrow did not even enter him. Nacheva pravivesha shokam. But the king, Mahanubhavaha, the mighty king, was pravivyathe. He was exceptionally disturbed, thinking of the calamity that has occurred to his son, especially since he himself was inadvertently responsible for it. And now, in the next chapter, we will see how Rama happily solves everything for King Dasaratha. There is not a moment of sorrow that he betrays. Nothing. To King Dasaratha, he is as tranquil and serene as ever. Mangalam Koshalendraya Mahaniya Gunabdeye Chakravarti Tanujaya Sarvabhaumaya Mangalam. Jai Sitaram.